The morning of March 15, 2026, started like any other at Kensington Palace. Catherine was planning her charity visit to a London hospital while Prince George prepared for his school presentation. Neither knew that within hours their lives would depend on decisions made in underground bunkers by people they'd never met. When the emergency alert pierced through every phone, television, and radio across Britain at 11:47 a.m., it carried just 4 words that would reshape the monarchy forever. Immediate lockdown, seek shelter. But this wasn't about a pandemic or natural disaster. This was something far more dangerous, something that made the Royal Protection Unit break every protocol they'd sworn to uphold. What happened next would test the very foundation of royal tradition, force impossible choices between duty and survival, and reveal secrets that the palace had hidden for decades. The story of why Catherine and George became the most protected people in Britain during those dark 72 hours isn't just about royal protocol. It's about a threat so severe that it made seasoned security experts abandon everything they thought they knew about keeping the royal family safe. The truth behind the 2026 lockdown has remained classified until now. This is the story of how 2 members of the royal family became the center of the most intense protection operation in British history, and why their survival would determine the fate of the monarchy itself. Catherine noticed something was wrong when her personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Mills, started checking her phone every 30 seconds. It was 9:15 a.m. on March 15, 2026, and they were supposed to be reviewing the schedule for her hospital visit. Instead, Mills kept glancing at the door and adjusting her earpiece with the kind of nervous energy that made Catherine's stomach tighten. "Is everything all right?" Catherine asked, setting down her coffee cup. She had learned to read the subtle signs of concern in her security team over the years, and Mills was practically radiating tension. Mills forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just routine communications, Your Royal Highness. Nothing to worry about." But Catherine wasn't convinced. In the past hour, she had noticed an unusual amount of activity around Kensington Palace. More security personnel than usual were stationed at various points, and there seemed to be an endless stream of unmarked vehicles arriving at the main gate. Even the household staff appeared on edge, moving with a purpose that suggested something significant was happening. 3 miles away at Lambrook School, Prince George was experiencing his own version of unusual circumstances. His personal protection officer, Sergeant James Crawford, had positioned himself closer to the classroom than normal, and George noticed that his teacher, Mrs. Henderson, kept checking her watch and looking toward the window. George was preparing for his presentation about British history when he spotted his father's private secretary, Edward Morrison, walking across the school courtyard with the headmaster. Morrison never came to the school unless something important was happening. The 10-year-old prince felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same feeling he got whenever royal duties interrupted his normal life. Back at Kensington Palace, Catherine's unease grew when her private secretary, Rebecca Thompson, entered the room with a tablet clutched against her chest. Thompson's usually perfect composure was cracked around the edges, and she kept shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Your Royal Highness, there's been a slight change to today's schedule," Thompson announced, her voice carefully controlled. "The hospital visit may need to be postponed." Catherine set down her papers. In 5 years of marriage to Prince William, she had learned that slight changes to royal schedules were rarely slight and usually indicated something serious was developing behind the scenes. "What kind of postponement are we talking about?" Catherine asked. Before Thompson could answer, the door opened and Commander David Phillips, the head of Royal Protection, entered the room. Phillips was a man who had dedicated his entire career to keeping the royal family safe, and Catherine had never seen him look as grim as he did at that moment. "Your Royal Highness," Phillips said, his voice formal but urgent, "I need to brief you on some developing security concerns." Catherine felt her heart rate increase. Security concerns could mean anything from terrorist threats to international incidents, and the fact that Phillips was delivering the briefing personally suggested it was serious. "Please sit down," Catherine said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What's happening?" Phillips remained standing, a habit that Catherine knew meant he was preparing to deliver particularly unwelcome news. "We've received intelligence indicating a credible threat to several high-profile targets across London. While I can't go into specific details, I can tell you that the threat level has been elevated significantly in the past 6 hours." Catherine's mind immediately went to her children, George, Charlotte, Louis. "All 3 children are accounted for and under enhanced protection," Phillips assured her quickly. "Prince George is secure at Lambrook School, and Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis are safe at their current locations." The use of formal titles rather than the children's names told Catherine that this conversation was being recorded or monitored, which meant the situation was even more serious than Phillips was letting on. What about William? Catherine asked. The Prince of Wales is in a secure location and has been fully briefed, Phillips replied. However, the nature of this particular threat requires us to implement some unusual protective measures. Catherine had been through enough security briefings to know that unusual protective measures typically meant her freedom of movement was about to become severely restricted. She also knew that Phillips wouldn't be having this conversation unless there was something specific about this threat that made it different from the dozens of others the royal family dealt with regularly. How unusual are we talking about? She asked. Phillips exchanged a glance with Detective Inspector Mills, and Catherine caught the subtle communication that passed between them. Whatever was happening, it was something they had discussed extensively before coming to her. The intelligence suggests that this particular group has been conducting surveillance on royal family movements for several months, Phillips explained carefully. They appear to have detailed knowledge of security protocols, daily routines, and preferred locations. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. The Royal Protection Unit went to extraordinary lengths to vary routes, timing, and security arrangements precisely to prevent this kind of intelligence gathering. If a group had managed to observe and catalog royal movements over several months, it suggested either a massive security failure or access to inside information. Inside access? Catherine asked quietly. Phillips nodded grimly. We believe there may have been a breach of security protocols at some level. Until we can determine the extent of that breach and neutralize the threat, we need to implement emergency protective measures. Catherine understood immediately what this meant. Emergency protective measures were the Royal Protection Unit's most extreme response to credible threats. They had only been implemented 3 times in the past decade, and each time had resulted in significant disruptions to royal duties and family life. For how long? She asked. We're hoping no more than 72 hours, Phillips said, but his tone suggested he wasn't confident about that timeline. At that moment, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message from William. Emergency meeting at BP. Can't explain now. Trust David completely. Everything will be fine. Buckingham Palace emergency meetings during the middle of a normal Tuesday meant the situation was escalating rapidly. Catherine looked up at Phillips and saw that he was watching her read the message. Your Royal Highness, I need you to understand that the next few hours are going to require some difficult decisions, Phillips said slowly. The nature of this threat is such that we may need to separate family members temporarily to ensure everyone's safety. Catherine's maternal instincts kicked into high gear. What do you mean by separate? The intelligence suggests that this group's primary targets are you and Prince George, Phillips said, his voice heavy with the weight of the information he was delivering. Based on intercepted communications, they view you both as the most valuable targets for their operation. Catherine felt the room grow cold around her. Being targeted as a member of the royal family was an occupational hazard she had accepted when she married William, but George was just a child, and the thought of anyone viewing her 10-year-old son as a target made her feel physically sick. Why us, specifically? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Phillips hesitated, and Catherine could see him weighing how much to reveal. The group appears to be motivated by a desire to destabilize the monarchy. Their communications suggest they believe that targeting you and the future king would create maximum impact. The phrase, future king, hung in the air between them. George wouldn't inherit the throne for decades, but in the eyes of those who wanted to harm the royal family, his position in the line of succession made him a symbol worth attacking. Catherine's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mother. Saw the news about increased security in London. Are you safe? The fact that news of increased security was already reaching the public meant the situation was larger than just a threat to the royal family. Catherine looked out the window and noticed that the usual bustle of London traffic seemed different somehow, though she couldn't immediately identify what was wrong. What aren't you telling me? Catherine asked Phillips directly. The commander's expression darkened further. The threat isn't isolated to the royal family, Your Royal Highness. We believe this group is planning coordinated attacks across multiple high-profile targets in London. The royal family is just one part of a much larger operation. Catherine felt the pieces beginning to fit together. The increased security, the emergency meetings, the unusual activity around the palace. It was all part of a response to something much bigger than a typical threat assessment. How much bigger? She asked. Phillips checked his watch, and Catherine noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. In all her years of working with the Royal Protection Unit, she had never seen Phillips show any sign of nerves. Large enough that the Prime Minister has been briefed and contingency plans are being activated across multiple government departments, Phillips said quietly. Catherine understood the implications immediately. If Downing Street was involved and multiple government departments were activating contingency plans, The threat was serious enough to potentially affect national security. "What do you need from me?" Catherine asked. Philip seemed surprised by the directness of her question. "At this moment, we need you to remain flexible and trust our judgment about protective measures. That may include temporary relocation, restricted movement, and limited communication with outside parties." Catherine nodded, understanding that she was about to enter a period where her normal life would be completely suspended. "And George? Prince George will remain under protection at Lambrook School for now, but we may need to move him to a secure location if the situation escalates," Phillips explained. The idea of George being moved to a secure location made Catherine's heart race. She knew that royal protection had safe houses and secure facilities throughout the UK, but the thought of her child being hidden away somewhere while facing an unknown threat was almost unbearable. "I want to be wherever he is," Catherine said firmly. Phillips and Mills exchanged another look, and Catherine caught something in their expression that made her stomach drop. "Your Royal Highness, the nature of this threat is such that keeping you and Prince George together may not be the safest option," Phillips said carefully. "In fact, our current assessment suggests that separating you might be the best way to ensure both of your safety." Catherine felt the world shift around her. The Royal Protection Unit was suggesting that she and her son would be safer apart than together, which meant the threat was specifically designed to target them as a pair. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Charlotte School. "Enhanced security measures in effect today. All students are secure. Updates to follow." The fact that Charlotte School was implementing enhanced security measures confirmed that this situation extended far beyond just Catherine and George. The entire royal family was being protected at an elevated level. "How soon do these measures take effect?" Catherine asked. Phillips checked his watch again. "Within the hour, Your Royal Highness." Catherine looked around her office at Kensington Palace, realizing that this might be the last normal moment she would have for days. In less than an hour, her life would be entirely controlled by security protocols designed to keep her alive in the face of a threat she couldn't fully understand. "One more question," Catherine said. "How certain are you about the intelligence?" Phillips met her eyes directly. "Certain enough that we've already begun implementing measures we hoped we'd never have to use." Catherine understood that this was as close to a confirmation as she would get. The Royal Protection Unit had contingency plans for every conceivable threat, including some that were so extreme they were rarely discussed even in training scenarios. If they were implementing those measures, the threat was real, immediate, and serious enough to justify extraordinary action. As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca Thompson reappeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. "Your Royal Highness, I've just received word that we need to prepare for immediate departure." Catherine looked at Phillips, who nodded grimly. "The situation is escalating faster than we anticipated. We need to move to the secure location now." Catherine stood up, her mind racing through all the implications of what was happening. In less than 3 hours, her normal Tuesday had transformed into a security crisis that would separate her from her children and hide her away from the public she served. As she gathered her personal items, Catherine couldn't help but think about George, who was probably still preparing his history presentation, completely unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. She wondered if he would understand why his mother couldn't be there to protect him, and whether the Royal Protection Unit's plans would be enough to keep him safe from whatever was coming. The sound of vehicles arriving outside drew Catherine to the window where she could see a convoy of unmarked cars taking position around Kensington Palace. Whatever was about to happen, there was no turning back now. The secure location turned out to be a facility that Catherine had never heard of, despite 5 years of security briefings. Hidden beneath what appeared to be an ordinary government building in central London, the bunker-like complex felt more like a military command center than a safe house. Catherine was escorted through multiple security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last. Biometric scanners, metal detectors, and armed guards created a maze of security that spoke to the seriousness of whatever threat had forced her underground. The briefing room was stark and windowless, dominated by a large table surrounded by monitors showing news feeds, security camera footage, and what appeared to be real-time tracking information. Seated around the table were faces Catherine recognized from the highest levels of government and security services. Home Secretary Margaret Davies looked up as Catherine entered, her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for your cooperation with these measures." Catherine took her assigned seat, noting that Commander Phillips had positioned himself directly behind her chair. Detective Inspector Mills stood at attention near the door, and Catherine realized that even in this secure facility, her personal protection detail wasn't taking any chances. "I think it's time someone explained exactly what's happening," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the surreal circumstances. Davies nodded to a man Catherine didn't recognize. a thin, sharp-eyed individual who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with national security crises. "Your Royal Highness, I'm Director James Whitfield, MI5, the man said, activating one of the large monitors. "What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest level, but you need to understand the nature of the threat we're facing." The monitor displayed a series of surveillance photographs showing various members of the royal family going about their daily activities. Catherine recognized images of herself leaving charity events, William at official functions, and with a chill that went straight to her heart, photographs of George walking to school. These photographs were recovered from a raid conducted early this morning on a property in East London, Director Whitfield explained. They represent approximately 6 months of surveillance conducted by a group calling itself the Republican Liberation Front. Catherine had never heard of the Republican Liberation Front, but the name itself suggested an organization opposed to the monarchy. The fact that they had been conducting surveillance for 6 months without detection was deeply troubling. "What do they want?" Catherine asked. Director Whitfield clicked to the next slide, which showed transcripts of intercepted communications. Based on intercepted messages and recovered documents, their objective is to stage what they call a symbolic strike against the monarchy that would force public debate about the relevance of royal institutions. Catherine scanned the text on the screen, picking out phrases that made her blood run cold. "Maximum symbolic impact, future king, change the conversation forever." "They're planning to kidnap George," Catherine said, the reality hitting her with devastating clarity. "That appears to be their primary objective," Director Whitfield confirmed. "However, their communications also indicate that you are considered an equally valuable target." Home Secretary Davies leaned forward. "The intelligence suggests they view you as the most publicly beloved member of the royal family, someone whose disappearance would generate massive public attention and sympathy for their cause." Catherine felt sick. The idea that her public service and charity work had somehow made her a target was almost unbearable, but worse was the realization that George's future position as king made him valuable to people who wanted to harm the monarchy. "How credible is this threat?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer given the extraordinary measures being taken. Director Whitfield's expression grew even more serious. "We assess it as highly credible. The group has demonstrated sophisticated planning capabilities, access to detailed intelligence about royal movements, and the financial resources to conduct extended surveillance operations." Catherine thought about the morning's events, remembering how her protection officers had seemed unusually tense. "You said there was inside access. What does that mean?" The room fell silent for a moment, and Catherine caught Davies and Whitfield exchanging a meaningful look. "We believe someone with legitimate access to royal protection information has been providing intelligence to this group," Director Whitfield said carefully. "We're currently conducting an internal investigation to identify the source." The implications hit Catherine immediately. Someone she trusted, someone who had access to her daily schedule and security arrangements, had been feeding information to people who wanted to harm her and her son. The betrayal was almost as shocking as the threat itself. "Do you know who?" Catherine asked. "The investigation is ongoing," Davies replied diplomatically, which Catherine understood to mean they had suspects but no proof. Commander Phillips spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Your Royal Highness, this is why we needed to implement emergency protocols immediately. If there is someone inside the security apparatus providing information, we had to assume that our normal procedures were compromised." Catherine looked around the room at the faces of people whose job it was to protect national security, and saw genuine concern in their expressions. These were individuals who dealt with serious threats on a regular basis, and they were clearly taking this situation very seriously. "What about the rest of my family?" Catherine asked. "Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis are in secure locations with enhanced protection," Davies assured her. Davies accord. "The Prince of Wales is at an undisclosed location where he's being briefed on the full scope of the situation." Catherine realized that William was probably having his own version of this conversation somewhere else, learning about threats to his wife and children that he was powerless to directly address. "And George?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Director Whitfield activated another monitor, this one showing a live feed from what appeared to be Lambrook School. Catherine could see the familiar buildings, but the camera angles suggested the surveillance was being conducted from well outside the school grounds. "Prince George remains at school under enhanced protection, but we've had to make some difficult decisions about his immediate safety," Director Whitfield said. Catherine's maternal instincts went into overdrive. "What kind of decisions?" Davies took over the explanation. The Republican Liberation Front's communications indicate they plan to attempt something today. The timing of their operation appears to have been designed around Prince George's school schedule. Catherine felt the room spinning around her. Today? They were planning to take him today? That's our assessment based on intercepted communications, Director Whitfield confirmed, which is why we had to implement immediate protective measures. The reality of how close they had come to a catastrophe began to sink in. If the intelligence services hadn't intercepted those communications, if the raid hadn't uncovered the surveillance photographs, if the security breach hadn't been detected, Catherine couldn't bear to think about what might have happened to George. Where is he now? Catherine asked, her voice strained. Commander Phillips answered. Prince George has been moved to a secure facility designed specifically for high-value protection. He's safe, but the nature of the facility means communication with family members is limited. Catherine understood that this was as close as Phillips could come to telling her that George was essentially in hiding, cut off from normal contact with his family, while security services worked to neutralize the threat. How long? Catherine asked. We're hoping to resolve the situation within 72 hours, Davies said. But that timeline depends on our ability to locate and apprehend the members of this group who remain at large. Catherine caught the phrase, remain at large, and realized that some arrests had already been made. You've arrested some of them? Director Whitfield nodded. The early morning raid resulted in 3 arrests, but we believe there are at least 4 more individuals involved in the operation. Until we locate them, we have to assume the threat remains active. Catherine thought about George, probably confused and frightened, wondering why his normal day had suddenly been disrupted by security personnel he didn't recognize. She imagined him asking questions that no one could answer, trying to understand why he couldn't go home or talk to his parents. I want to speak to him, Catherine said firmly. Davies and Whitfield exchanged another look, and Catherine could see them weighing security concerns against her parental rights. Communication protocols in the secure facility are designed to prevent location tracking. Phillips explained carefully. Any contact could potentially compromise the security of the location. Catherine understood the logic, but the mother in her was struggling to accept that she couldn't even speak to her frightened child. He doesn't understand any of this. The protection team at his location includes specialists trained in working with children, Davies assured her. They understand his unique circumstances and are providing appropriate support. Catherine knew that appropriate support from trained specialists wasn't the same as comfort from his mother, but she also understood that the people in this room were trying to keep George alive. What happens if you don't find them? Catherine asked. Director Whitfield's expression darkened. We'll find them, but until we do, both you and Prince George remain at significant risk. Catherine looked around the room again, taking in the monitors, the security feeds, and the grim faces of people whose job it was to protect national security. She realized that this bunker-like facility might be her home for the next 3 days, while somewhere else in London, her son was experiencing his own version of protective isolation. There's something else, Davies said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. The Republican Liberation Front's communications suggest this operation is part of a larger campaign designed to destabilize the monarchy over time. Catherine felt a new chill run through her. What does that mean? It means this may not be an isolated incident, Director Whitfield explained. Their intercepted messages reference future operations and long-term goals that extend beyond this immediate threat. The implications were staggering. Catherine was learning that she and George weren't just facing a single kidnapping attempt, but were apparently the first targets in a sustained campaign against the royal family. How long has this been going on? Catherine asked. Director Whitfield consulted his notes. Based on recovered documents and communications, we believe this group began planning anti-monarchy operations approximately 18 months ago. The surveillance of your family appears to have been part of their operational preparation. Catherine tried to process the idea that for 18 months, while she had been conducting charity work and raising her children, a group of people had been planning ways to harm them. The violation of privacy and safety felt overwhelming. What do they ultimately want? Catherine asked. Davies answered this time. According to their communications, they want to force a national conversation about abolishing the monarchy. They believe that a high-profile incident involving popular members of the royal family would generate enough public support to pressure the government into holding a referendum on the future of royal institutions. Catherine realized that she and George had become pawns in a larger political game, symbols whose safety or lack thereof could be used to advance an anti-monarchy agenda. And they think kidnapping a child will generate support for their cause? Catherine asked, unable to hide her disgust. Their communications suggest they believe public sympathy for Prince George would eventually turn into anger at the institution that put him at risk, Director Whitfield explained. It's a calculated approach designed to use emotional manipulation to achieve political goals. Catherine understood now why the security response had been so immediate and comprehensive. This wasn't just about protecting two members of the royal family, it was about preventing a political crisis that could threaten the stability of British institutions. Her phone, which had been modified with special security features, buzzed with a message from William, "Safe location secure. Being briefed on full situation. Thinking of you and the children. Trust the people protecting us." Catherine realized that William was probably learning the same information she was, possibly watching the same surveillance footage and intercepted communications that demonstrated how close their family had come to catastrophe. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. Commander Phillips answered. "Now we wait while the investigation continues. You'll remain here where we can guarantee your safety, while Prince George remains in his secure facility. Meanwhile, MI5 and the Metropolitan Police are working around the clock to locate the remaining members of this group." Catherine looked at the monitors showing news feeds from around London, where life was continuing normally for everyone except her family. She wondered how many people going about their Tuesday afternoon had any idea that members of the royal family were hidden away in secure facilities, protected from a threat that could reshape the monarchy. "One more question," Catherine said. "If this group succeeds in what they're planning, what happens to the monarchy?" Davies and Director Whitfield exchanged a final look, and Catherine could see that this question had been discussed extensively in other rooms with other officials. "That would depend on how the public responds," Davies said carefully. "But their assessment isn't entirely wrong. A successful attack on the royal family, particularly involving popular members like yourself and Prince George, could indeed force a national conversation about the future of the monarchy." Catherine understood that the stakes extended far beyond her personal safety or even George's well-being. The Republican Liberation Front had correctly identified that attacking the right targets could potentially achieve their political objectives, which was why the government's response had been so swift and comprehensive. As she settled into what would likely be her temporary home for the next several days, Catherine couldn't help but think about George, somewhere else in London, probably asking questions no one could answer about why his life had suddenly become so complicated and frightening. 24 hours into the lockdown, Catherine had learned to interpret the subtle changes in the behavior of her protection team that indicated whether the news was good or bad. When Detective Inspector Mills checked her phone and immediately left the room without making eye contact, it usually meant bad news. When Commander Phillips adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before speaking, it meant he was about to deliver information Catherine wouldn't want to hear. Catherine was experiencing both signals as she sat in the secure facility's main briefing room, waiting for the morning update on the investigation's progress. The windowless room had become her entire world, with its constantly running news feeds and security monitors providing the only connection to the outside world. Director Whitfield entered the room carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of expression that suggested the past 24 hours hadn't gone according to plan. Behind him, Home Secretary Davies looked like she hadn't slept, which probably meant she actually hadn't slept. "Your Royal Highness," Director Whitfield began, settling into his chair, "I need to update you on some developments in the investigation." Catherine had learned to brace herself whenever these briefings began, with formal titles rather than more casual conversation. "What's happened?" "We've made progress in identifying the remaining members of the Republican Liberation Front," Whitfield said, activating one of the large monitors. "However, the investigation has also revealed some complications we didn't anticipate." The monitor displayed photographs of 4 individuals, 3 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 20s or 30s. They looked like ordinary people, the kind of faces Catherine might pass on the street without a second thought, which somehow made them more frightening than if they had looked obviously dangerous. "These are the individuals who remain at large," Whitfield continued. "Marcus Thompson, Sarah Williams, David Chen, and Rebecca Foster. All have been under surveillance for the past 18 months as part of various domestic security operations." Catherine studied the faces, trying to understand how these 4 people had managed to organize such a sophisticated threat to her family. 18 months? You've been watching them for 18 months and they still managed to plan this operation? Davies answered this time, her voice carrying a note of frustration that suggested this question had been asked in other meetings. They were being monitored as part of broader domestic extremist surveillance, but their activities didn't rise to the level that would have justified more intensive intervention. Catherine understood the implication, The security services had been aware of these individuals as potential threats, but hadn't recognized the specific danger they posed to the royal family until it was almost too late. "What changed?" Catherine asked. Whitfield consulted his tablet before answering. 3 weeks ago, our surveillance detected an increase in their operational communications. They began using more sophisticated encryption and started meeting in person rather than communicating electronically. Catherine realized that the Republican Liberation Front had been smart enough to change their behavior patterns when they moved from planning to implementation, which had made them much harder to track. "But you were still monitoring them," Catherine pointed out. "To a limited degree," Whitfield admitted, "but they appear to have become aware that they were under surveillance and took steps to avoid detection." Catherine felt a chill run through her. How did they know they were being watched? The question hung in the air for several seconds, and Catherine could see Davies and Whitfield exchanging the kind of look that suggested this was the most troubling aspect of the entire situation. "That's one of the complications I mentioned," Whitfield said carefully. "Our investigation into the security breach has revealed that someone with access to domestic surveillance information may have warned them." Catherine felt the room grow cold around her. "You're saying someone in the government tipped them off?" "We're saying that someone with legitimate access to classified information appears to have been providing assistance to this group," Davies corrected. "Whether that assistance came from within the government or from other institutions with access to security information is still being determined." Catherine understood that she was learning about a security breach that extended far beyond the Royal Protection Unit. Someone with access to sensitive intelligence about domestic terrorism surveillance had been helping the Republican Liberation Front avoid detection. "How high up?" Catherine asked. Whitfield and Davies exchanged another look, and Catherine could see them weighing how much to reveal. "High enough to access operational intelligence about ongoing surveillance operations," Whitfield said finally, "which means we're dealing with a serious compromise of national security infrastructure." Catherine realized that the threat to her family was just one part of a much larger security crisis that could have implications for how the government monitored and responded to domestic terrorism. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from William, "Still safe. Told situation has become more complex. Missing you and the children terribly. Stay strong." Catherine looked up from her phone to find Commander Phillips watching her with concern. "How is Prince George handling this?" Catherine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Phillips consulted his own tablet before responding. "The protection team reports that he's been asking a lot of questions, but he's cooperating with security protocols. He understands that he can't go home yet, but he doesn't understand why." Catherine's heart ached, thinking about George trying to make sense of a situation that even adults were struggling to understand. "What have you told him?" "The truth, adapted for his age level," Phillips replied. "He knows that there are some bad people who want to hurt members of the royal family, and that he needs to stay in a safe place until those people are caught." Catherine appreciated that they weren't lying to George, but she also knew that a 10-year-old's understanding of bad people couldn't encompass the political motivations and sophisticated planning behind the Republican Liberation Front's operation. "Is he scared?" Catherine asked. Phillips hesitated, which told Catherine that George was probably more frightened than anyone wanted to admit. "He's being very brave, but yes, he's asked several times when he can talk to you and when he can go home." Catherine felt tears threatening and had to take several deep breaths to maintain her composure. The idea that George was scared and asking for her while she sat powerless in a secure facility was almost unbearable. "What about Charlotte and Louis?" Catherine asked. "This is a bad activity. Both children are secure and handling the situation well," Davies assured her. "Princess Charlotte has been told that it's a special security exercise, and Prince Louis is young enough that the disruption to routine isn't causing significant distress." Catherine was grateful that her younger children weren't experiencing the same level of fear that George was probably dealing with, but she also realized that the different approaches being taken with each child reflected the varying levels of threat they faced. "Why aren't they all together?" Catherine asked. Director Whitfield answered. "Security protocol requires separating high-value targets to prevent a single successful operation from achieving multiple objectives." Catherine understood the cold logic of keeping the family separated, but the mother in her wanted all her children in one place where she could protect them. "Have you learned anything else about their plans?" Catherine asked, trying to focus on the investigation rather than her family's separation. Whitfield activated another monitor, this one, showing what appeared to be architectural. Analysis of recovered documents from the East London raid has revealed some disturbing details about their operational planning. Catherine studied the drawings, which appeared to show the layout of a building she didn't recognize. "What building is this?" "Lambrook School," Whitfield said quietly. Catherine felt her stomach drop. The Republican Liberation Front had architectural drawings of George's school, which meant their planning had been far more sophisticated than she had initially understood. How detailed? Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. Extremely detailed, Whitfield replied. They had information about security systems, daily routines, staff schedules, and even the locations of emergency exits. Catherine realized that the group hadn't just been planning to grab George randomly. They had been preparing a carefully orchestrated operation that accounted for every aspect of his school environment. Inside information again? Catherine asked. Davies nodded grimly. This level of detail could only have been obtained through someone with legitimate access to the school's security infrastructure. Catherine felt sick thinking about someone at George's school, someone trusted with the safety of children, providing information to people planning a kidnapping. The violation of trust felt almost as devastating as the physical threat. Do you know who? Catherine asked. The investigation is ongoing, Davies replied, which Catherine had learned was diplomatic speak for, we have suspicions but can't prove anything yet. Director Whitfield activated yet another monitor, this one showing surveillance footage from various locations around London. However, we have made some progress in tracking the movements of the remaining 4 suspects. Catherine watched grainy security camera footage showing figures moving through what appeared to be train stations and shopping centers. The individuals were clearly trying to avoid direct camera angles, but their movements suggested they were still in London. They haven't left the city? Catherine asked. Our assessment is that they're planning to continue with some version of their operation, Whitfield said. In a roulette, in fact, the video contrasts my narrative. Intercepted communications suggest they view the current lockdown as a temporary setback rather than a complete failure. Catherine felt a new wave of fear. They're still planning to try something? That appears to be the case, Davies confirmed, which is why we can't reduce security measures until all 4 individuals are in custody. Catherine looked around the secure facility that had become her temporary home, realizing that she might be here for longer than the initially estimated 72 hours. What exactly are they planning now? Catherine asked. Whitfield consulted his tablet again. Intelligence suggests they're adapting their operation to account for the enhanced security measures. Rather than attempting to grab targets from known locations, they appear to be planning to force those targets into situations where they're more vulnerable. Catherine didn't like the sound of forcing targets into vulnerable situations. What does that mean? Davies answered this time. We believe they may be planning to create a crisis that would require members of the royal family to leave secure locations. Catherine understood immediately. The Republican Liberation Front was smart enough to realize that they couldn't reach their targets while they were hidden away in secure facilities, so they were planning to create circumstances that would force those targets into the open. What kind of crisis? Catherine asked. Unknown at this time, Whitfield admitted. But their communications reference alternative scenarios and forcing conditions. Catherine realized that the group was essentially playing a game of chess, thinking several moves ahead and preparing contingencies for every possible response from the security services. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her private secretary. Media starting to ask questions about your absence from scheduled events. How should we respond? Catherine looked up at Davies and Phillips, realizing that the public nature of royal duties meant that her disappearance from scheduled events would eventually attract attention. How long before the media figures out something's wrong? Catherine asked. Davies checked her own phone before answering. We estimate we have perhaps another 24 hours before speculation becomes serious enough to require a public response. Catherine understood that once the media began investigating her absence, maintaining the secrecy of the security operation would become much more difficult. What happens then? Catherine asked. That will depend on the progress of the investigation, Director Whitfield said. If we can apprehend the remaining suspects within the next day or two, we may be able to resolve the situation without public disclosure of the full threat. Catherine realized that she was trapped not just by physical security concerns, but also by the need to maintain public confidence in the royal family's safety and security. A public revelation that the future king had been targeted for kidnapping could have exactly the kind of destabilizing effect that the Republican Liberation Front was hoping to achieve. As the briefing concluded and Catherine was left alone with her thoughts, she couldn't help but think about George, somewhere else in London, probably wondering why his mother couldn't come to see him, and when his life would return to normal. The irony wasn't lost on her that, in trying to protect the monarchy, the security services had been forced to hide away the very people the monarchy was supposed to represent. Catherine looked at the news feeds showing normal life continuing across London, and wondered how many people walking past government buildings had any idea that beneath their feet, members of the royal family were living in underground facilities, protected from threats that could change the course of British history. Catherine was awakened at 4:30 a.m. on the second day by the sound of urgent voices in the corridor. After 36 hours in the underground facility, she had become attuned to the different tones and rhythms that indicated whether developments were positive or negative. The hurried footsteps and sharp exchanges she was hearing suggested something significant had happened. Detective Inspector Mills appeared in her doorway within minutes, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern that Catherine hadn't seen since the crisis began. "Your Royal Highness, I need to ask you to dress quickly and come to the briefing room," Mills said. "There's been a major development in the investigation." Catherine was fully awake immediately. After a day and a half of waiting for news while feeling completely helpless, the prospect of a significant development was both thrilling and terrifying. The briefing room was more crowded than Catherine had ever seen it, with additional faces she didn't recognize seated around the main table. Director Whitfield was standing at the front of the room next to a large monitor that was displaying what appeared to be a map of London, with multiple colored markers. "Your Royal Highness," Whitfield began as soon as Catherine was seated, "I'm pleased to report that we've successfully apprehended 2 of the 4 remaining suspects." Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she noticed that Whitfield's expression suggested the news wasn't entirely positive. "That's wonderful," Catherine said. "What happened?" Home Secretary Davies activated another monitor, this one showing surveillance footage from what appeared to be a residential area. At approximately 2:15 this morning, Metropolitan Police conducted simultaneous raids on 2 properties in South London based on intelligence gathered from the suspects arrested in Tuesday's operation. Catherine watched the footage showing armed police officers moving efficiently through what appeared to be ordinary London flats. The operation looked professional and controlled, nothing like the dramatic raids she had seen in television programs. Marcus Thompson and Sarah Williams were taken into custody without incident, Davies continued. Both individuals were found in possession of materials that confirm their involvement in the planned operation against your family. Catherine felt another wave of relief, though she was conscious that 2 suspects remained at large. "What about the other 2? Director Whitfield's expression darkened. David Chen and Rebecca Foster were not at the raided locations. However, the arrests of Thompson and Williams have provided us with crucial intelligence about their whereabouts and intentions. Catherine could tell from Whitfield's tone that this crucial intelligence wasn't entirely good news. "What did you learn?" Catherine asked. Whitfield activated a third monitor, this one showing what appeared to be text messages and email communications. Both suspects had electronic devices containing recent communications with Chen and Foster. These communications reveal that the Republican Liberation Front has moved to what they call Phase 2 of their operation. Catherine felt her stomach tighten. Phase 2? Davies took over the explanation. The original plan to target Prince George at school was designated as Phase 1. When that operation was prevented by the enhanced security measures, the group activated an alternative plan. Catherine realized that the Republican Liberation Front had been sophisticated enough to plan for the possibility that their initial operation would be detected and prevented. "What's the alternative plan?" Catherine asked, though she was already dreading the answer. Whitfield displayed another screen showing architectural drawings, but these weren't of Lambrook School. Catherine recognized the layout immediately and her blood ran cold. "Kensington Palace," she whispered. "Phase 2 involves an operation to infiltrate Kensington Palace and create a hostage situation that would force you and Prince George to return from secure locations," Davies explained. Catherine felt the room spinning around her. The Republican Liberation Front had correctly calculated that the Royal Protection Unit would eventually have to bring the family back to public locations, and they were planning to be waiting when that happened. "How?" Catherine asked. Director Whitfield displayed more recovered documents. The communications indicate they have detailed knowledge of palace security systems, staff schedules, and emergency protocols. Catherine was learning that the security breach extended even deeper than she had initially understood. Someone with intimate knowledge of Kensington Palace's operations had been providing information to the Republican Liberation Front. "Inside access again," Catherine said. Davies nodded grimly. The level of detail in these plans could only have come from someone with regular access to palace security infrastructure. Catherine thought about all the people she interacted with on a regular basis at Kensington Palace: household staff, security personnel, administrative assistants, maintenance workers. The idea that one of them had been betraying her family's security was devastating. "Do you know who?" Catherine asked. For the first time since the crisis began, Whitfield looked genuinely pleased. "That's part of the positive development. Analysis of the communication patterns and information contained in the recovered documents has allowed us to identify the source of the security breach." Catherine held her breath, waiting to learn which member of her trusted circle had been working against her family. Thomas Bradley, a member of the palace maintenance staff who has worked at Kensington Palace for 8 years, Davies announced. Catherine recognized the name immediately. Bradley was responsible for maintaining the electronic security systems throughout the palace, which would have given him access to exactly the kind of information the Republican Liberation Front needed for their operation. 8 years, Catherine repeated, thinking about how long Bradley had been part of the trusted team responsible for her family's safety. The investigation suggests his cooperation with the Republican Liberation Front began approximately 6 months ago, Whitfield explained. Financial records indicate he received significant payments in exchange for providing security information. Catherine felt sick thinking about Bradley walking through Kensington Palace every day, maintaining the very security systems that were supposed to protect her family, while secretly providing information to people planning to harm them. "Where is he now?" Catherine asked. "In custody as of 30 minutes ago," Davies said with satisfaction. "He was arrested simultaneously with the raids on Thompson and Williams." Catherine felt some measure of relief knowing that the source of the security breach had been identified and eliminated, but she was still conscious that 2 dangerous individuals remained free. "What about Chen and Foster?" Catherine asked. Whitfield's expression grew serious again. "This is where the situation becomes more complex. The communications recovered from Thompson and Williams suggest that Chen and Foster have already begun implementing Phase 2. Catherine felt her brief moment of relief evaporate. "They're already at the palace?" "Not exactly," Davies said carefully, "but they appear to be in position to attempt infiltration when conditions are right." Catherine realized that the Republican Liberation Front was playing a waiting game, positioning themselves to strike when the security services eventually had to return the royal family to normal activities.
"What conditions?" Catherine asked.
Director Whitfield consulted his tablet. The communications reference waiting for target movement and reduced security posture. "We believe they're waiting for you or Prince George to return to Kensington Palace." Catherine understood that she was trapped in a strategic stalemate. As long as she and George remained in secure facilities, they were safe from the Republican Liberation Front. But the moment they returned to normal life, they would be walking into a trap. "How long can we stay here?" Catherine asked. Davies and Whitfield exchanged a look that suggested this question had been the subject of considerable discussion. "That depends on several factors," Davies said diplomatically. "Public scrutiny of your absence from scheduled events is increasing, and we're facing pressure to provide some kind of explanation for the disruption to royal duties." Catherine realized that the very public nature of royal responsibilities was working against her family's security. Unlike other high-value targets who could disappear without public notice, members of the royal family were expected to maintain visible schedules that made extended hiding impossible. "What kind of pressure?" Catherine asked. Davies activated another monitor showing news headlines from various British media outlets. Catherine could see speculation about her health, rumors about family crises, and questions about the unusual security activity around royal locations. "The story is beginning to take on a life of its own," Davies explained. "If we don't provide some kind of official explanation soon, the speculation could become more damaging than the truth." Catherine understood that the Republican Liberation Front had been clever enough to plan for this eventuality as well. By creating a situation that required extended security measures, they had forced the royal family into a position where maintaining secrecy became increasingly difficult. "What are my options?" Catherine asked. Director Whitfield responded. "We've developed several scenarios for safely returning you and Prince George to normal activities while maintaining enhanced protection." Catherine noticed that Whitfield had said returning rather than if you return, which suggested that staying in hiding indefinitely wasn't considered a viable option. "What scenarios?" Catherine asked. Davies activated another monitor showing what appeared to be detailed security plans. Option 1 involves a coordinated public appearance under extremely controlled conditions, designed to draw Chen and Foster out into the open where they can be apprehended. Catherine didn't like the sound of using herself and George as bait. Option 1 sounds dangerous. "All the options carry some degree of risk," Whitfield admitted. "But our assessment is that the current situation is unsustainable beyond another 24 to 48 hours. Catherine realized that the clock was running out on their ability to keep the crisis secret, which meant they would soon be forced to take action regardless of the risks involved. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from William. "Briefed on latest developments. Proud of your strength. Whatever comes next, we face it together as a family." Catherine looked around the room at the faces of people whose job it was to keep her safe, and realized that they were all waiting for her to make decisions about risks she couldn't fully evaluate. "What do you recommend?" Catherine asked. Davies and Whitfield exchanged another look, and Catherine could see that they had already discussed this question extensively. We recommend proceeding with a modified version of Option 1, Davies said, a carefully controlled public appearance that provides multiple opportunities for law enforcement to apprehend Chen and Foster while minimizing risks to you and Prince George. Catherine thought about George, who had been hidden away in a secure facility for 2 days, probably confused and frightened and wondering when his life would return to normal. She thought about Charlotte and Louis, who were also being kept away from their normal routines because of threats they couldn't understand. When? Catherine asked. Director Whitfield checked his watch. We propose implementing the operation tomorrow afternoon. That gives us time for final preparations while preventing further deterioration of the media situation. Catherine realized that within 24 hours, she would be leaving the safety of the secure facility to participate in an operation designed to draw dangerous criminals out of hiding. The thought was terrifying, but the alternative of indefinite separation from her children was equally unbearable. What about George's safety? Catherine asked. Prince George will be part of the operation under the highest possible level of protection, Phillips assured her. The entire operation is designed around ensuring his safety while creating opportunities for law enforcement to act. Catherine understood that she was about to agree to put herself and her son in a carefully controlled, dangerous situation in order to end a threat that could otherwise continue indefinitely. I'll do it, Catherine said quietly. But I want to understand every detail of the plan before we proceed. Davies smiled for the first time since the crisis began. Of course, Your Royal Highness. We'll spend the rest of the day going through every aspect of the operation. As the briefing concluded, Catherine couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in just 2 days. From a normal Tuesday morning planning charity visits to agreeing to participate in a law enforcement operation designed to capture terrorists, the transformation was almost surreal. But as she prepared to learn the details of an operation that would determine her family's safety, Catherine also felt a sense of relief that the waiting was almost over. Whatever happened next, at least they would be taking action, rather than simply hiding and hoping that someone else could solve the crisis for them. The morning of March 18th dawned gray and drizzly, which Director Whitfield had assured Catherine was actually advantageous for the operation they were about to undertake. Overcast skies would provide better cover for the dozens of surveillance teams and armed police officers who would be positioned throughout central London. Catherine had barely slept, despite the assurances she had received about the comprehensive security measures being implemented. Today, after 3 days of hiding in underground facilities, she and George would participate in what MI5 was calling Operation Royal Standard, a carefully orchestrated public appearance designed to draw the remaining Republican Liberation Front members out of hiding. The plan was deceptively simple. Catherine and George would make a surprise visit to the Children's Hospital where Catherine had originally been scheduled to appear 3 days earlier. The visit would be announced just 30 minutes before their arrival, giving Chen and Foster minimal time to prepare, but creating an irresistible opportunity for them to attempt their kidnapping operation. Catherine was reviewing the final security briefing when Detective Inspector Mills appeared with the news she had been both dreading and anticipating. Your Royal Highness, Prince George has arrived at the staging area. Catherine's heart raced at the prospect of seeing her son for the first time since the crisis began. She followed Mills through the secure facility's corridors to a meeting room where George was waiting with Commander Phillips and a child psychologist who had been helping him understand the situation. George looked smaller than Catherine remembered, and she could see the strain of the past 3 days in his face despite his attempt to smile when she entered the room. Without thinking about protocol or the presence of security personnel, Catherine rushed to embrace her son. "Mummy," George said quietly, hugging her tightly. "I missed you so much." Catherine held George close, feeling tears she had been holding back for 3 days finally begin to flow. "I missed you too, sweetheart. Are you okay?" George nodded against her shoulder, but Catherine could feel the tension in his small body. "The people have been very nice, but I want to go home. When can we go home?" Catherine looked over George's head at Commander Phillips, who nodded encouragingly. "Very soon, darling. We just need to do one more thing to make sure it's safe, and then we can all go home." George pulled back to look at her, and Catherine saw maturity in his 10-year-old eyes that hadn't been there 3 days ago. "The bad people who want to hurt us?" Catherine was struck by George's direct understanding of the situation. Despite the efforts to shield him from the full truth, he clearly grasped the essential reality of their circumstances. "Yes," Catherine said honestly, "but there are a lot of good people working very hard to keep us safe." George looked around the room at the security personnel, then back at his mother. "Are we going to help catch them?" Catherine was amazed by George's courage, but also concerned about the burden being placed on such young shoulders. "We're going to do what the experts think is safest for everyone." Director Whitfield chose that moment to enter the room. carrying the kind of tablet and serious expression that Catherine had learned meant it was time for final preparations. "Your Royal Highness Prince George," Whitfield said formally, "if you're ready, I'd like to walk through the operational timeline one final time." Catherine and George took seats at the briefing table, and Catherine noticed that George was trying very hard to sit up straight and pay attention like an adult. The sight of her son trying to be brave in such frightening circumstances made her heart ache. "The timeline is straightforward," Whitfield began, activating a monitor that showed a map of central London. "At 2 p.m., the palace will announce that you're making a surprise visit to Great Ormond Street Hospital. At 2:30 p.m., your convoy will depart from this location for the hospital." Catherine studied the route on the map, noting the various markers that indicated surveillance positions and emergency response teams. "The hospital visit will last approximately 45 minutes, Whitfield continued. "During that time, we anticipate that Chen and Foster will attempt to position themselves for their operation." George raised his hand tentatively, and Catherine was touched by his politeness despite the circumstances. "Yes, George?" "Will the sick children at the hospital be safe?" George asked. Catherine felt a surge of pride at her son's concern for others, even while facing his own dangers. Director Whitfield's expression softened noticeably. "The hospital has been completely secured, Prince George," Whitfield assured him. "No patients or staff will be at any risk during your visit." George nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with this assurance. Catherine asked the question that had been worrying her most. What if Chen and Foster don't take the bait? Davies, who had just entered the room, answered. "Intelligence suggests they've been monitoring news about your scheduled activities very closely. Their intercepted communications indicate they're specifically waiting for an opportunity involving a public appearance." Catherine understood that the Republican Liberation Front's obsession with symbolic targets made it highly likely they would attempt something during a hospital visit, especially one involving sick children that would generate maximum public sympathy if something went wrong. "And if they do take the bait?" Catherine asked. Commander Phillips responded this time. "We have over 100 surveillance officers and armed response teams positioned throughout the area. The moment Chen and Foster make any move toward you or Prince George, they'll be intercepted." Catherine looked at George, who was listening to this conversation about people trying to hurt them with remarkable composure. She wondered what the psychological impact of all this would be on him in the years to come. "George," Catherine said gently, "do you have any questions about what we're going to do?" George thought for a moment before answering. "Will Daddy be there?" Davies answered. "The Prince of Wales will be at a separate location for security reasons, but he'll be fully briefed on everything that happens." George nodded, though Catherine could see disappointment in his face. The family had been separated for 3 days, and the security requirements meant they couldn't even be reunited for this operation. "One more thing, George," Catherine said. "During our visit to the hospital, there will be a lot of police and security people around, but they'll be hidden so we can't see them. If anything unusual happens, you need to do exactly what Commander Phillips tells you to do, okay?" George looked at Phillips, who smiled reassuringly. "We've practiced what to do if there's any kind of problem, haven't we, Prince George?" George nodded. "Get low, stay close, and listen for instructions." Catherine was simultaneously proud of George's preparation and heartbroken that her 10-year-old son needed to know procedures for staying safe during a potential attack. At 1:45 p.m., Catherine and George were escorted to the secure garage where their convoy was waiting. Catherine was surprised to see that their usual royal vehicles had been replaced with unmarked cars that looked like ordinary government transportation. "Part of the operational plan," Detective Inspector Mills explained. "We want Chen and Foster to have to get closer to identify their targets." Catherine understood the logic, but the sight of unmarked vehicles rather than the familiar royal cars made the whole situation feel even more dangerous and unpredictable. The ride to Great Ormond Street Hospital was unlike any royal visit Catherine had ever experienced. Instead of the usual relaxed conversation and final preparations, she and George sat in tense silence while their protection officers maintained constant radio communication with surveillance teams positioned throughout London. 2 minutes out, Commander Phillips announced as they approached the hospital. "All stations report ready." Catherine squeezed George's hand and was amazed by how calm he appeared. "Are you nervous, sweetheart?" "A little," George admitted, "but I want to help catch the bad people so we can go home." Catherine realized that George understood better than anyone that their family's safety depended on the success of this operation. As their convoy pulled up to the hospital entrance, Catherine could see what appeared to be normal hospital activity, but she now knew that every person visible was actually a security officer or surveillance specialist. The level of preparation was both reassuring and frightening. Remember, Philip said quietly as they prepared to exit the vehicle, act natural, follow your normal routine for hospital visits, and trust that we're watching everything. Catherine and George walked into Great Ormond Street Hospital, hand in hand, knowing that somewhere in the surrounding area, two dangerous individuals were probably watching and planning their next move. The children's ward they visited was filled with young patients who had no idea they were part of an elaborate law enforcement operation. For 30 minutes, Catherine and George visited with sick children, read stories, and participated in the kind of genuine royal engagement that Catherine had always found most rewarding. The normalcy of the interactions was surreal, given the circumstances, but Catherine could see that George was finding comfort in the familiar routine of royal duties. It was during their visit to the cancer ward that Catherine noticed increased activity among the security personnel. Phillips was receiving more frequent radio communications, and Detective Inspector Mills had positioned herself closer to Catherine and George. "Your Royal Highness," Phillips said quietly, appearing at Catherine's side, "we need to begin moving toward the exit." Catherine's heart rate spiked. "Have they?" "Two individuals matching our targets were spotted approaching the hospital perimeter," Phillips said calmly. "Everyone is in position." Catherine looked at George, who was reading to a 7-year-old girl receiving chemotherapy. Her son was being brave and kind and normal, even while people who wanted to harm him were closing in. "George," Catherine said gently, "we need to say goodbye now." George hugged the little girl he had been reading to and promised to send her some books. As they walked toward the hospital exit, Catherine felt like they were moving through a dream where everything appeared normal but nothing actually was. The hospital corridors seemed longer than usual, and Catherine found herself paying attention to every face they passed, wondering if any of them might be Chen or Foster in disguise. Phillips and Mills flanked them closely, their professional calm masking what Catherine knew must be intense alertness. They were 50 feet from the exit when Phillips received a radio communication that made him instantly tense. "Targets have entered the building," he said quietly to Catherine. "Continue walking normally toward the exit." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice. Chen and Foster were inside the hospital, probably close enough to see Catherine and George. She squeezed George's hand and was amazed that he continued walking calmly beside her. "Mummy," George whispered, "is this when the bad people get caught?" "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine whispered, "but very soon now." They were 20 feet from the exit when Catherine heard Phillips receive another radio communication. "Suspects in custody. Operation successful. Repeat, both suspects are in custody." Catherine felt her legs go weak with relief. It was over. After 3 days of hiding, planning, and fear, the Republican Liberation Front had been neutralized. "Is it finished?" Catherine asked Phillips quietly. "It's finished," Phillips confirmed, the tension finally leaving his voice. "Chen and Foster are both in custody, and the immediate threat has been eliminated." Catherine looked down at George, who was still holding her hand, and walking calmly toward their waiting convoy. "We can go home now, can't we?" "Yes," Catherine said, finally allowing herself to smile. "We can go home." As they reached the hospital exit, Catherine could see their convoy waiting exactly as it had 3 days ago when this nightmare began. But now, instead of racing toward a secure facility, they would be returning to Kensington Palace and their normal life. The ride home was completely different from the tense journey to the hospital. Phillips was relaxed. Mills was smiling, and George was asking excited questions about what would happen to the bad people who had wanted to hurt them. "They'll go to court," Catherine explained, "and then probably to prison for a very long time." George considered this seriously. Good. People shouldn't try to hurt other people. Catherine couldn't argue with that assessment. When their convoy arrived at Kensington Palace, Catherine saw William waiting at the entrance, flanked by Charlotte and Louis. After 3 days of separation and fear, the sight of her complete family together and safe was almost overwhelming. George ran to his father and siblings, and Catherine watched as William enveloped all 3 children in a huge embrace. When William looked up at Catherine over their children's heads, she could see tears in his eyes that matched her own. "Welcome home," William said quietly as Catherine joined their family embrace. Later that evening, after the children were safely in bed and the immediate crisis had been thoroughly debriefed, Catherine and William sat in their private sitting room at Kensington Palace, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 days, William said, shaking his head. 3 days that felt like 3 years. Catherine agreed. "I keep thinking about how normal everything seemed on Tuesday morning. I was planning a hospital visit, George was preparing for school, and then within hours, our entire world was turned upside down." William reached for her hand, but we got through it. "The children are safe, the threat has been eliminated, and we can move forward." Catherine nodded, though she knew that the psychological impact of the experience would take much longer to process than the immediate crisis had taken to resolve. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. William smiled. "Now we go back to being a normal royal family with normal royal problems. Hospital visits, school runs, charity events, all the things that seemed so complicated before but now seem wonderfully simple." Catherine thought about George's courage during the operation, Charlotte and Louis's resilience during the separation, and William's strength throughout the entire ordeal. Their family had been tested in ways she had never imagined, and they had emerged stronger and more united. The Republican Liberation Front had planned to use Catherine and George as symbols to destabilize the monarchy, but instead, their failed operation had demonstrated the strength and resilience of the royal family in the face of genuine danger. As Catherine prepared for bed in her own room at Kensington Palace, for the first time in 3 days, she reflected on how the crisis had changed her perspective on royal duties and public service. The experience had reminded her that being a member of the royal family meant accepting certain risks, but also that those risks were worth taking in service of something larger than personal comfort. Tomorrow, she would return to her normal schedule of royal engagements, charity work, and family responsibilities. The Republican Liberation Front would face trial for their crimes, the security breaches would be investigated and resolved, and life would move forward. But Catherine knew she would never again take for granted the simple pleasure of tucking her children into their beds at Kensington Palace, surrounded by the security and normalcy that made everything else possible.